Hi, I'm Drew. With me is Chris, and you're listening to the first episode of Couch Co-op, Damage Control's experimental podcast, made with duct tape, spit, and dreams. We're going to give this a few episodes and see if we get a feel for it, see if it works, see if it's interesting. Yeah, I'm really setting the bar high here.
You want to introduce the first topic, Andrew?
No, I don't, Chris.
All right, so I'll go with it. We're going to talk about the history of the Legend of Zelda. We'll talk about all the games in the series, some of the pros and cons of each of the games, and have a discussion on how we rank them and what we consider to be the definitive best game in the series.
Yes, not necessarily the Zelda-iest Zelda game, but just best experience, you know. What did we have the most fun playing? What do we look back to as the high water mark of the series?
Oh, not a water temple. Not a water we're not like, you don't have to play a song and then the high water mark raises. Cuz I don't like doing that.
You don't like doing that?
No. We don't have to do like a water temple version of the podcast, do we?
Yes, we do. But
okay.
You know, since we're such elite people, we can use the strangely much easier Master Quest water temple.
That's true. All the dungeons were easier in the Master Quest.
Well, once you figured out what the basic conceit with the Ocarina of Time Master Quest Remix dungeons is, you know, they couldn't just like build new ones from scratch because that was too resource intensive. So you had the same basic shape and all of the same rooms with different stuff in them, and they just made you go through them in just about the most backwards order they could make. So you actually really had a good idea where you were going once you've picked up on that.
And not only were you already familiar with the dungeon layout in general, but because all the enemies were significantly more difficult, by the time you got to the bosses difficulties weren't increased at all, so you just beat the ever-living snot out of them immediately. So the Master Quest kind of just prepped you to beat it easier.
Yeah, but, you know, it was a different experience enough that, you know, I enjoyed it a bit better than just playing through Ocarina of Time again.
Well, yeah, I definitely enjoyed it, and it was worth the challenge for parts of it, like when you're fighting the Dark Nuts as young Link and stuff like that. It definitely gave an increased difficulty on certain parts, but they didn't do anything to increase the difficulty of the bosses. They could have made those even artificially harder by just giving them more health or anything, making it take more hits or making them do more damage to you. Well, anyway, so we decided to start in the middle of the series. So how about
why not? It was a nice familiar jumping off point.
I think Ocarina of Time, no matter what, will always be the keystone, the one definitive game that is always the referenced material. Whenever you refer to The Legend of Zelda without prefacing which one you're talking about, I think people just think Ocarina of Time as the gold standard for what a Zelda game is. And then positive or negative will compare and contrast based off of the Ocarina of Time.
Well, let's start by working backwards a bit. Let's skip over Zelda 4 for the moment, because I think that one of the things that people look to Ocarina of Time as a first three-dimensional Zelda, but also as, you know, the template that the future games from that point followed, at least the console ones. Because, like, you know, the Zelda plot has been described as beat 3 dungeons, then beat 8 dungeons.
Well, it's beat 3 dungeons, do something cool, earning you the Master Sword, and then beat 7 or 8 dungeons.
Yeah, but the problem is that describes A Link to the Past.
It does, which could also be known as Ocarina of Time 2D. Unless you call Ocarina of Time Link to the Past 3D, which is, how we called it growing up.
Super Ocarina of Time, or
64.
Ocarina of Time 16.
Link to the Past 64.
Yeah, but I think that despite those similarities, that I definitely agree that Ocarina of Time is used by just in popular culture as the symbol of a Zelda game.
The gold standard.
That was the game that came out to the most spectacle, and to this day inspires the most nostalgia. It's like the Final Fantasy VII of Zelda in that respect, because of its impact on
That's true.
Fandom and pop culture. And you sound very disappointed by that.
I am, but that's just because I'm a Final Fantasy VI guy.
Well, that's a subject for another podcast. But yes,
but yeah, it is a very, very legit analogy.
Yeah, it's an
it was
epoch
that
game.
that sweet spot in the mid to late '90s that really defined video games in the three-dimensional generation.
Yeah, and that was part of like the big year, 1998 of huge year for gaming, because it was Ocarina of Time, it was like Metal Gear Solid, StarCraft, all sorts of like
GoldenEye.
GoldenEye.
Yeah, so definitely the N64 and the PlayStation 1, that arms race, did even more for the video game world than the Super Nintendo, Sega, Genesis.
Yeah, I would agree to that, even though that Super Nintendo, the 16-bit console wars are the ones that get the attention, the lip service, but the real arms race was Nintendo and Sony in the 32-bit era.
Yeah, but we're kind of getting a little off topic. So.
Yeah, I mean, but sticking to the N64 era, though, there's also Majora's Mask, and I kind of have to defer to you on the quality of that, because I have barely played Majora's Mask, despite the remake coming out for the 3DS. It's in my game flag queue, but it's like a dozen games down.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about Majora's Mask. I have purchased 2 versions of Majora's Mask in bonus discs for the GameCube, and my girlfriend Sarah has purchased Majora's Mask 3D for the new 3DS, and I still never played the game. So that is the extent of how much I can help you with Majora's Mask.
Double defer.
We
have to take the physical challenge now.
Well, okay. Well, we do have to. I've played a little bit of Majora's Mask. I've gotten to the point where I was able to get the Deku Shrub mask off. So, like the opening scene, I completed that. I think I shot a Deku Seed at Tingle's balloon once. And I think the moon killed all the things. That's all I remember.
Well, can we agree that probably the best Zelda game was one that released before Majora's Mask, because that was before Tingle existed?
That's true. Tingle automatically brings down the quality of any game he is in by 1 full letter grade.
Yep, and Tingle certainly encouraged people hating on him for his role in the Wind Waker.
Yeah, he was actually even worse than Wind Waker, which is unfortunate, because Wind Waker had a lot of positives going for it. It actually, oddly enough, felt to me more like the original Legend of Zelda.
In what way?
The whole ocean felt like the way Hyrule Field was in the Legend of Zelda, where because it was 2D, it felt like this big, flat landscape where you could go in any direction. It felt so open and, I don't want to say lonely. Like you felt like you were in the middle of nowhere. You're in the middle of the ocean. You're in the middle of this open, vast land.
Well, I mean, say for, a smattering of shopkeepers, old ladies selling suspicious liquids, and a bunch of dudes who want you to buy them new bushes when you barge into their house. There wasn't really much going on as far as population in the first Zelda.
As the majority of Wind Waker is just open water. But it almost felt to me like Wind Waker, its storyline, could replace the original Legend of Zelda in a storyline that had Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask coming before it. Because Legend of Zelda and Adventure of Link are the last two in one of the timelines. And it feels like you have to do the same thing with Wind Waker as you do in the original. You actually have to find physical pieces of Triforce. You have to go explore a vast land that doesn't seem to have any direction to it. Like you have, starting with Link to the Past and even Adventure of Link, which is a complete departure from the series. Starting with Link to the Past, you have different types of terrain features and landmarks that give you a visual representation of where you are in the world in relation to other parts, where all of a sudden in the original Legend of Zelda, there's no transition. You're in one spot, you're in a forest, then all of a sudden you're in a desert, or you're all of a sudden in a graveyard, or you're in a grassy area. It just felt like so open and confusing, and to me, Wind Waker had that same open and confusing feeling where you're sailing, all of a sudden, boom, you're at a location. There's a dungeon there. There's nothing else around for nautical miles, and this is the dungeon you've just found. There's no reason for it to be there. You haven't, went across Hyrule Field, gone up a path through Koriko Village, gone up Death Mountain, and now you're at the top of Death Mountain at the entrance of a volcano. You never get that feeling like you're making a progression through different terrain features. You're just explore. Boom, something out of the ordinary, an oasis in the middle of nowhere. There's your objective. So it just felt like a 3D interpretation of the original Legend of Zelda that got flooded.
The Wind Waker was actually the first Zelda game I really felt like I had to give up on. And the reason why is because there is so much game in the Wind Waker, especially when you consider the collectathon aspects that would require you to replay the game multiple times, so you'd have the color pictograph from the onset.
I agree. And I think Ocarina of Time and other games in the N64 era, including Mario 64, found what we would consider a collectathon sweet spot. In the Ocarina of Time, you had the 100 gold sculptulas, you had different rupee wallets to get, you had the ice arrow, you had different seed pouches, you had quiver sizes, you had a couple of different side quests that you could do, but it was manageable. Getting 20 hearts, getting 20 heart containers, finding all the heart container pieces, it was something you could do as part of your main campaign. You never felt like the side quests in Ocarina of Time were taking you so far out and away from the main quest that you lost perspective of what you were actually trying to accomplish.
Well, that's
You,
one of the things that Ocarina of Time and some of the other games in the series did very well was rewarding exploration, because you weren't necessarily out to find a heart piece, even if you could spot one. It's basically, they would have different places that if you were observant or you were clever with your items that you could get to, and when you got there, there would always be something there for you. There would be a piece of heart. There would be, a little treasure of some sort
yes.
to reward you exploring every nook and cranny.
And the main quest would take you along a path that would actually lead you to these secrets if you were curious enough while you were walking past it. You would come across the stump that you needed to play your ocarina for the frogs organically as you were making your way to the Zoras. You'd come across the scarecrows organically as you were in Lake Hylia exploring around. You'd also, of course, come across the fishing pond, but the fishing pond wasn't so distracting that you had to stay there for hours and hours. You only had a couple objectives in the fishing pond. You could stay longer if you wanted to, but as far as the collectathon needs, you could accomplish that pretty quickly. When you had the magic bean salesperson, you'd buy the magic beans off of him, and immediately you see one patch of ground where you could plant that seed, and then you thought back, oh, I've seen this in a lot of places. None of those places were out of the way, hard to find, and you'd gradually come to those. And you'd be able to find all of those spots that none of them were so far out of the way. There wasn't so many of them that you weren't able to get all of them done. It was something that I had no problem getting the 100% completion in Ocarina of Time, the same way I got the 100% completion in Mario 64. Getting 120 stars was very difficult, it was time consuming, but it was doable. It was something that took you a little bit longer than just completing the main quest.
Yeah, whereas in the Wind Waker, trying to, get not just pictures of every enemy, but, what the game determined to be a good, perfect picture of the enemy to start, carving all of the little figurines. I
Right.
mean, that was not doable. That required multiple playthroughs, especially if you screwed up the pictures of one-time enemies, didn't have a save file to go back to, or even in the final fight with Ganon.
I honestly think after taking a well-framed shot of the moon for your first pictographed side quest is the last time I used the pictograph, because it just seemed like a boring chore. And there was a lot of boring chore to be had in the Wind Waker.
Yeah, and bringing it back to Tingle, you had to go find the map. Then you had to get money to have Tingle translate the map. Then you had to go where the map was, hope you're on the right spot, fish down, and get the chest 8 times.
We had the same problem with Mario Sunshine. Beating the game didn't involve that much time, but trying to get all 250 blue coins. Some of those blue coins could only be achieved by squirting a bird that was flying around in Delfino Plaza. Just ridiculous things that would take 3 times as long to accomplish than just playing through the game. There was many more. Well, they weren't stars; they were shines, and
We know what they are.
But either way, whether you got a star or it says shine get, I guess we could talk about horrible translations another time. The collectathons in the GameCube era really made those games disappointing, because the previous generation got you geared and ready and wanting for 100% completion. Knowing that you could get 100% completion in Ocarina of Time made you want to get 100% completion in Wind Waker. So when you couldn't, it made it that much more frustrating.
Yeah, though another aspect of the collectathon was an element actually introduced to the series and repeated many times over the games. It was introduced to the series in Link's Awakening, where you would have this long, almost story, almost the length of the entire story, chain of passing one item to another character and and getting something in return and passing that on to someone else in the area that the story took you to next, and so forth. Through the game until you eventually got a very nice or very powerful prize, and in some cases that contributed greatly to your arsenal. In other cases, it was just moving the story along.
That's true. Ocarina of Time did do a good job of that. And of course, if you completed that single item side quest, you eventually got to the point where you could get the eye drops for the Big Goron?
Yeah, Bigoron.
Bigoron, to get his Bigoron sword, which the Bigoron sword, you can get that anytime after you complete the Fire Temple. So you can actually get that before you even do the Water Temple, which makes not only completing the Water Temple much easier, because when you're fighting Shadow Link in the Water Temple, you have the Bigoron sword.
You have reach.
You have reach, and he becomes easy. He becomes about as hard as a Staloth Knight when you have the Bigoron sword. The other major advantage of having the Bigoron sword is in the final form of Ganon, at the end of the game, he knocks away the Master Sword. The game expects you to somehow throw bombs or something at his tail. I don't know. I've never not had the Bigoron sword. But having the Bigoron sword makes the final form of Ganon absolute cakewalk. You hit him 2 or 3 times in the tail with the Bigoron sword, and you can go get the Master Sword right after that. So that side quest isn't just an interesting progression that brings you throughout all of Hyrule Field and from all the different points in the game, whether it be on top of Death Mountain, whether it be down in Lake Hylia, to the Lost Woods, to Hyrule Castletown. It takes you all over the place, and at the end, you get an amazing weapon. On the contrary, one of the most difficult parts of the game, the challenge mode, or the challenge dungeon of Ocarina of Time, is the Thief's Hideout.
Or something like that. It was definitely intended to be, supposed to be the Gerudo training.
At any rate, it's a lot of fun. It's very varied. But the reward at the end is an ice arrow that, unless you're having fun, is completely useless. I mean, it's cool to use it, but by the time you earn it, it's already just a gimmick.
Yeah, unlike the Bigoron sword, it takes the entire inventory. Every weapon and item that Link gets in every single dungeon, including as adult Link. The only time you really get to use the ice arrow is in Ganon's Tower, and there's really nothing to do with it there.
No, it's cool for completion purposes. Earning it was fun. Like, even if the final prize was a purple rupee, which is the ultimate kick in the face, I'd still go through the process because it was a thing to do. It was a well-designed dungeon, and that's one of the things you love about Zelda games is the well-designed dungeons, even if there's not something awesome at the end of it.
Alright, so you mentioned dungeons, specifically well-designed dungeons, as being one of the basic parts of a Zelda game. What are the other components you would say?
I feel like there's 2 major aspects of a Zelda game, and then a third aspect that's kind of filtered in and included in those two major aspects. You have the dungeons, of course, which we were just talking about, and those dungeons have to include varied enemies, different challenges, and of course puzzles. You also find varied enemies, different challenges, and puzzles in the overworld. The overworld is what I would consider the adventure aspect. In the original Legend of Zelda, you have almost exclusive adventuring in the overworld. There's no towns. There's a couple of cryptic messages that don't actually help you out. The whole game is exploring this vast overworld, trying to find the next dungeon in the series. In the dungeons, you typically find another item or sub-weapon that changes the way you play the game in a certain way. Usually, like if you find a boomerang, you'll fight a boss that requires the use of the boomerang. You'll complete a puzzle that requires a boomerang to complete. And if the game as a whole is well packaged, you'll then use that boomerang multiple times to solve multiple problems, and perhaps even have to backtrack to different parts of the game to use that boomerang to unlock previously unavailable areas.
I think you're describing Metroid at this point.
Also Castlevania. But that's another podcast. So, I guess I would have to say there's probably three major aspects that you could kind of grade a Zelda game. You have the dungeons, the overworld, and the items and sub-weapons.
Alright, well, let's do some quick hits here for some of the games we haven't talked about, like Twilight Princess.
Twilight Princess has some of the coolest sub-weapons. One of them is a spinning top that zips you around the temple. A lot of fun, but you only use it once. You only use it in that dungeon. It's a dungeon exclusive item. It has dual wielding hook shots, which is fun, is used a lot. It feels a lot like Ocarina of Time Part 2. You have a lot of the same sub-weapons and items. Twilight Princess didn't really push the envelope as far as game design is concerned. It kind of reiterated what had already existed without really creating anything new. It just made it bigger and darker. It basically takes the same gameplay and style of Ocarina of Time with a little bit of the darkness of Majora's Mask and expands it to a much larger scale. Hyrule Field is darker, more dreary, and probably 3 times the size of Hyrule Field in Ocarina of Time. It has the same basic weapons. You have the sword and the shield, you have the slingshot, your boomerang. They made improvements to the boomerang. I believe this was the first game where your boomerang was able to hit multiple targets.
No, they did that in Wind Waker.
Oh, that's right. Twilight Princess did come after Wind Waker. Yeah, so they basically used the upgrade that came from Wind Waker for your boomerang. It has the standard bottles, the bombs, hero's bow. The one item that is really unique, and although the idea itself is not super unique, and I honestly cannot pronounce what these people are called. The I'll let you try to pronounce their species.
Oh, it's just lots of... My God, that looks creepy. Wow, that's nightmare fuel.
Yeah, well, you go to their home
It's just
world.
2 O's, 2 C's, and 2, like, Oku?
Ooh.
Like, with those, all the... It sounds like I have to, like, be... It sounds like I have to say everything longer because all the letters are doubled.
Well, Anyway, the weird, creepy chicken people and the little chicken people head, it uses a waypoint system similar to, I believe it was Feore's Wind was the waypoint system used in Ocarina of Time.
Possible.
Been a long time.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
So I'd say the items in general, I mean they're good. It has different armors that you can get. One of the armors makes you indestructible, but it eats rupees. It's one of those items that you're not sure why they designed it that way, and you get it, but you never bother using it because it's so impractical.
Well, it's probably designed mostly for when you're at the end of the game and have nothing to buy anyway, and your rupee total just sits at the maximum.
That is literally exactly what happened for me. I played through the game originally on the Wii instead of the GameCube, which I wish I would have played it on the GameCube.
You're conflicted about whether Link is left-handed?
I don't really care that he's right-handed or left-handed. Obviously, Link is supposed to be left-handed. The function of the motion controls in Twilight Princess was just shy of completely meaningless. All they really did is map the A button to the motion control. So instead of having a tight, concise button press for swinging the sword, you had to shake the controller. It didn't improve the control of the game. It didn't improve the control of the camera. And the entire world is mirror imaged so that Hyrule Field is laid out backwards. So the entire game doesn't feel right because the whole game is backwards. You're not gaining enough by playing the Wii version because there's not much, if anything, of a graphics upgrade. And I honestly think you might be losing a bit of fidelity in the control scheme. So the game would actually feel better on the GameCube because the layout of Hyrule Field is the way you expect.
Alright, so Skyward Sword is a bit of a mixed bag as far as like the overworld quality goes. It's different from most of the other games because, you know, the overworld just comes in self-contained chunks. But there's also more so than any other Zelda game, there's an emphasis on puzzle solving in the overworld chunks in Skyward Sword. And that which really makes it stand out.
Skyward Sword, it has a very polarizing dichotomy. I think I'm using buzzwords that don't fit properly. On one hand, Skyward Sword is the most fun, innovative, amazing Zelda game ever. It's just absolutely brilliant. On the other hand, it is the stupidest, most annoying, frustrating, shitty Zelda game ever. And I'm including Adventure of Link. No, I'm not. That one still sucks. You can edit that out. It does a great job with the visual style, which not everybody liked. I thought the visual style was really compelling. I thought they did a great job with many aspects of the combat when the combat worked. They made an attempt at doing a one-for-one with Link's sword and your Wiimote. But they didn't do a one-to-one. They did a modified one-to-one. So, if you start with your Wiimote pointing to the bottom left, and you bring your Wiimote up to the top right, Link will swing from the bottom left to the top right. That works. Then, if you want to swing from the bottom left to the top right again, you would think slowly bring the sword back down and then whip it back up again. But that will not work. If you move the Wiimote down, he will swing down.
So it doesn't take the accelerometer into account. It's just you make a motion and he swings.
If you swing from the bottom left to the top right, he will swing right. In order for you to get him to swing up and to the right again, you have to start from where you already are and swing up and to the right even more. And for somebody who actually has sword fighting training, it is actually very difficult to get used to the not quite one-to-one that they made for the controller. So that can get very frustrating for a couple of reasons. The main reason, they made Skyward Sword artificially more difficult by having more damage caused when you hit an enemy. In most Zelda games, especially at the beginning of the game, when an enemy hits you, you only lose half a heart, maybe one heart. You only start with 3 hearts. Some enemies already take 2 hearts out of you. There are also many enemies that have electrified weapons that they use for defense. And they'll hold them horizontally or vertically depending on how you're slashing. If you make a mistake in your swinging motion because you're expecting one-to-one, an enemy that's holding an electrified weapon blocks you, it takes 2 hearts out of your health. Now, I don't mind a little extra difficulty in my Zelda games. I always enjoy a more difficult Master Quest version. But when that difficulty is coming artificially from a bad gameplay mechanic or control scheme, that gets very frustrating very fast. Some of the things that are really fun with the motion controls are some of the sub-weapons like I was talking about earlier. There is a flying gold beetle that you use, and you use the Wiimote held horizontally pointing towards the screen. In the same fashion that you fly, you control the beetle. And eventually you'll get clamps or pinchers on the beetle, and you'll be able to grab things. For example, grab a bomb and then fly the beetle into the target and blow it up. Again, you get back to the problem with the hardware not being as good as the software wants it to be. The Wiimote loses its orientation and you have to recalibrate it almost every time you use the beetle. You have to go into a pause menu and press a button and recalibrate your Wiimote very often throughout the game.
So how do you feel about the system-based experimental controls for Skyward Sword compared to the system-based experimental controls for Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks on the DS?
I think there's a lot of similarities, but with touchscreen, you have just as much touch sensitivity as you would with a button. You have an instant press down and what you want happens. Motion controls for me, in any game that I've played with motion controls, never feel quite as crisp and instant as physical analog buttons do. Now, with Phantom Hourglass, I think they did a great job of making a bite-sized little brother version of Wind Waker, in the same way that Link's Awakening was kind of a bite-sized little brother version of Link to the Past. And they also, and in doing so, they made some slight concessions for the reduced hardware specs. And they used the available hardware of the DS in such a way that, yes, it changes the basic way you're used to controlling Link, but they designed the game so well, they designed the overworld exploration so well, and the progression through dungeons so well around the new mechanic that after about an hour, it became second nature. It felt right. You had to draw where you wanted to go with the stylus, and I don't think they needed to do that, but when you take that mechanic to ship controls, it actually felt more natural and more fluid to be able to draw out a course on the bottom map and just watch your boat go in the course you drew automatically, which allowed you then to control either the cannon or whatever sub-weapon you had. I think the cannon might have been the only sub-weapon available to you, but it allowed you to look in the direction you wanted to shoot without worrying about navigating to where you were trying to go.
So you're saying it was more fluid on the ocean.
Even though it felt a little bit awkward when you were navigating on the ground, you got used to it. And it was a worthwhile concession to change your ground movement in order to make the ocean navigation that much better.
And as much as I want to call out the uniqueness of the overworld sections of Skyward Sword, I definitely want to call out the uniqueness of the dungeons in Phantom Hourglass, because they were very different dungeons. I mean, they had a lot of interconnected, smallish sections, little hallways, small rooms, but the way your path through a dungeon had just such a perfect ebb and flow, and it would always lead you back to the entrance after you made some great accomplishment. Not just you beat a mini-boss, you get a little teleporter portal for some reason that brings you back to the entrance. It's a multi-floor dungeon. You go up, you go through rooms, you come back down, you go around, you find, the item of the dungeon, and you can use that item to, in that same room usually, to open a previously inaccessible path that leads you right back to the entrance. That just lets you just jump back in the dungeon diving right where you left off. And that was also part that made the most unbearable part of the game later on more bearable and full of esteem, being that central Phantom Dungeon, where, the first time you go in, it's just not fun. There's like one very specific way you have to take with the item you have, but when you come back after collecting a few more items, after collecting arrows or the hook shot or bombs, suddenly each floor has 4 or 5 different ways to go through the floor.
I have to agree with you on your assessment of the dungeon design working very well in making that central dungeon that you keep coming back to always varied. Even though it's the same dungeon every time, you approach it differently based off of, again, the sub-weapon items that you get throughout the game. I do disagree with you on your consideration of it being generally unbearable. I think I always liked that dungeon. It never got old.
It always, before, some of the paths wouldn't open up immediately sometimes, because you had to go through every floor every time, but you didn't necessarily have a new way to go through the earlier floors each time. Like, I think the first floor, I'm really going back to the dusty memory, but, to really take the different path through the first floor, you needed the hook shot, and the hook shot was an item that you got much later in the game. So you just have to do the first floor the same way, like 3 or 4 times before you got to try out new ideas.
Right. I don't remember, honestly, because this was many years ago. I don't remember being bored with or frustrated by that central dungeon. I think I remember going through it and seeing that there was lots more that I could do and anticipating what I was going to do and realizing, wait a second, as I keep going through this and my time keeps going down and down and down, there are different shortcuts you can take. There are different time boosters that you can get, the little hourglasses that fill up your time. It became one of those, and I'm never much of a speedrun person, but this was such a small, quick snippet of game design that I was already becoming more and more familiar with, having to go through it so many times. I actually naturally became a good speed runner at it without having to try very hard. When I finally got to the end of the game, I was able to complete the entire dungeon in what is essentially 0 seconds, because I was able to go through it fast enough and get enough time boosts where when I got to the end, it showed that no time had passed. And that was very satisfying. So even though you have to go through it so many times, I'm not normally one for a speed challenge, but I was still able to accomplish that, which made that more satisfying than it might be for somebody who is always doing a speed run.
I would have to say the most satisfying part about that dungeon was you finally had the right equipment to kill the phantoms.
Okay, that's true. I'll give you that one.
That was one of...
Yes.
Remains to this day one of the most gratifying experiences I've ever had playing video games.
Finally killing those darn phantoms was, after all that time of just having to hide behind them. Yes, I definitely agree there. Speaking of dungeons, and going back to Skyward Sword, where I was talking about the dichotomy of one of the greatest games ever and one of the worst games ever, one of the best aspects of Skyward Sword is its dungeons. And all the dungeons were layered. And I say all the dungeons, there weren't that many of them. There were a lot of restrictions to the size and scope of Hyrule, but with the areas that you were able to explore, the design is just amazing. Every dungeon, you actually almost didn't know when you finally got to the dungeon, because the outside of every dungeon was a mini dungeon in and of itself. The terrain getting to the dungeon was filled with monsters, puzzles, and a variety of tasks. It was like you were having to solve a dungeon just to get to the dungeon. It added a lot of depth. It was very interesting. It was very fun. It added a lot to the experience. The overworld, unfortunately, there wasn't much of an overworld. It was kind of, you'd take your loft wing, which is... Let me interrupt myself by saying there's only one way to travel through Hyrule, and that is on feet. Either Link's or Epona's. You don't travel on a boat.
Epona doesn't have feet.
They're feet. Horses have feet.
They don't have feet.
Hooves are feet.
No, that's like saying... No, hooves are like toes, not feet.
They're feet. Horse feet. Alright, fine. There are only 2 ways to travel through Hyrule. Either on foot or on horseback. You don't travel by boat. You don't travel by bird. And holy crap, do not travel by train. Nothing takes the adventure out of an adventure than being on rails. That's all I have to say about Spirit Tracks. It's a disaster. We'll get back to Spirit Tracks. I was talking about Skyward Sword. I interrupted
I don't
myself.
know. Should we get back to Spirit Tracks?
Well, we do want to mention that it did make some improvements on those slight problems that we had in Phantom Hourglass. It did improve some of the control, but that control isn't utilized very much because you spend so much time on a train going from place to place with just terrible train controls, and it's just boring and dumb, and I don't like it. And then when you get to the dungeons, if you were just Link in the dungeons, the control scheme would work flawlessly. But of course, they had to add the whole spirit part of Spirit Tracks, and you use Zelda's spirit in the Guardian shells, so you're essentially controlling two characters at the same time, which then makes the whole experience very convoluted and difficult. And even though they did a great job with the dungeon design, as they typically do, it was artificially difficult because you're basically playing co-op by yourself. I never made it through Spirit Tracks. I couldn't get through it.
Moment of silence, apparently, for your lost time playing that game.
Yeah.
Chris and I will be back next time in episode 2 of Couch Co-op, where we continue the Zelda discussion into the two-dimensional realm, and we also finally crown our champion of the series. Don't miss it.